to radically rethinking railways in Australia, with the maddest of mad professors, here to convince you that everything you've ever been told about Australian railways is wrong. If you are new to the channel, find links to our previous episodes below this video. The mission of this channel, now up to its 15th episode, has been to fight those porcupines that people have been telling about our railways since their beginning in 1854. Although if you believe they began in 1854, you might be wrong there too, as human-powered and horse-powered wagonways famously existed in Newcastle in the Awabakal land, Goolwa in Wurundjeri country, and here at Port Arthur on Palawa, also called Tasmania. We are in Tasmania to help fight a certain pervasive narrative about freight transport, which says that freight trains can only work if distances are long and lines are straight as narrow. While we are here, we'll also look at passenger trains. You might believe Tasmania has none. Well, again, that is wrong. It has several tourist trains and hopefully more coming soon. We will take a leaf from our episode What's in a Name and ask ourselves, what is a tourist train? And does it matter? Going back to the narrative, let's be clear. Rail as a mode of goods haulage definitely has some advantages where the journey is long. But this has been given frequently as a reason why worthwhile freight projects could not be supported, and why many existing lines have been closed. In episode 8, Who Blamed Roger Rabbit?, we looked at the narrative that says that road transport killed off rail transport in Australia. And sure, many goods traffics did move over to road from rail. But in that episode, we dispelled the notion that this was a deliberate plot from the road camp. Instead, rail bureaucrats and politicians refused to reorient rail transport to make it competitive with road until it was far too late. The 1970s rail systems had an unhealthy resemblance to the 1920s rail systems, despite the fact that the immature technology of road in the 1920s offered rail some protection, not by the 1970s. But their failure required a cover story, so several were built up. This length of journey narrative is not just used to justify the failure of individual lines or traffics, but whole systems. For example, more favourable climate in central North America means many thousands of tonnes of wheat is moved from inland American states and Canadian provinces, over thousands of kilometres to coastal markets and ports. This gives the large North American railroads a solid base that would be hard for road to match. Taking a single wheat truck over several days and multiple drivers to get that truck from Nebraska to California, to British Columbia, let alone a train length of such wheat trucks, is an event of such scale as to give rail a good run-up start. In Australia, we have some similarly long runs, though these depend on either intermodal goods or minerals, as most wheat and agricultural production is only moving from the fertile inland zones, little more than 300 kilometres in most cases, to the nearest coastal port for export. It gives rail a bulk product advantage, being able to shift a train length of product in one move, but no distance advantage, and often runs afoul of the need to double handle the product. But the crossings to Perth and Darwin are harsh. There are few, if any, natural places to recruit a pool of truck drivers from en route, if we were to run a relay, or else the driver must keep his brakes and slow the total journey. Transcontinental freights can have crew cars, fully equipped ex-sleeping cars, from trains like our Overland or GAN, but fitted with beds, lounge rooms and dining facilities. That way, the train can keep moving while multiple crews take turns to work it in shifts. With the locomotives able to cross the country without refuelling, this gives us a non-stop journey time. And if the trains didn't have to pass other trains in loops, it might be literally non-stop. There is no way a truck can beat this. And with improvements made to the lines, first by Australian National then by ARTC. These lines can sustain point-to-point journey times that are competitive with road, and offset the inconvenience of multiple handling of the payload. But how does that help Tasmania? The network of Tasmania is narrow gauge and small. Historically, it had a good density of lines, stretching from beyond Smithton in the far northwest, and right round from Queenstown via Zeehan and Burnie, on a mix of private and public lines, round to Hobart and Florentine in the south of the island, with branches to Herrick, St Mary's, Bell Bay, and others. Time has seen many of these lines close in part or full. Though given the apocalyptic narrative that's been applied to some mainline networks, perhaps we should be lucky to see lines like the Fingal, Boyer or Bell Bay lines are still in business, and further, have actually been upgraded to an excellent standard for a slow freight network. The remaining traffics are timber, cement, general intermodal freight, minerals including coal, paper. The longest journey on the network now is Burnie to Boyer at around 320 kilometres, though the longest possible journey on the network, if anyone found a traffic to carry, would be from beyond Burnie at Rosebery to Boyer around 400 kilometres. This compares with the Sydney to Perth journey of 4,000 kilometres, or 10 times as long. So clearly, if the narrative applies, then the Tasmanian network should have gone to God a long time ago. Yet we see it as a thriving, state-owned corporation. It's had a terrible history. Just as we said earlier, the 1920s Tasmanian system survived with little change to 1970. Only perhaps the loss of steam traction. But every other policy, including the multitude of small stations, tiny four-wheel wagons, slow trains and overmanning, was still in place when Gough Whitlam became PM and offered to take the system off the Tasmanian government's hands. Hobart had a suburban rail system, and we will talk about that more later. But for now, the system was one of the state's largest employers, and a burden on the small state government as traffic shrank. The federal offer was generous, as by 1970 it was just as likely to completely close as anything. Even though one positive decision to build a new line from Launceston to Bell Bay breathed some new life into it. It also recognised that Hobart could not continue as an interstate port at the southern end of the island, meaning that many traffics that needed a mainland connection would go through Burnie, Devonport, or the new facility at Bell Bay. The federal government, of course, didn't want the passenger trains, and the last of these, the Tasman Limited, was gone in a few years. Efforts were made to get rid of some of the surplus. Lines to Stanley, Fingal to St Mary's, Sheffield and others, as well as divest the general less than carload traffics and stick to the bulks. The system was also mainlandised, with South Australian and Queensland general traffic locomotives replacing the Tasmanian quirks, like the Old English electric diesels and vacuum-braked wagons. While AN appeared to be having some success at least holding the system intact, it was privatised through a number of operators. The condition allowed to run down until closure of more lines, such as the Herrick line, now shortened to Scottsdale, or the Wiltshire line, and the line beyond Boyer, presaged the likelihood of total closure. Thankfully, sanity prevailed, and government decided to keep it as a state-owned enterprise called Tasrail. This is an extremely meagre body, run out of a small single-storey building no bigger than a suburban house, in an industrial estate near Launceston. Your mad professor had the privilege of visiting it, and the East Tamar Junction Depot and Works, which is the last major facility. Certainly it is a humble railway, with humble managers, and no pretense to greatness that you would have found in the TGR in Hobart in the early 70s. The first thing that keeps the network going is effective subsidy, especially for the improvements to track and rolling stock. We should not be ashamed of that. Of course, the road, sea and air industries in Tasmania are also underwritten. They have to be. Trying to be efficient does not conflict with the need for subsidy. It just means we need tight and humble management. Compare this to the mainland systems like Victorian railways or the New South Wales government railways. In truth, Victoria doesn't really have much more traffic on its network than Tasmania, if we don't count the interstate trains and a bit of seasonal wheat. You can be sure the legacy V-Line management system is not so humble, and they don't run it out of a humble industrial estate. Their head office is in the expensive Docklands district. Managing a rail freight system should always be a blue-collar job, even at the CEO level, not something you find in the cafe districts of the big cities. Most of the track is now welded rail on concrete sleepers and on ferro-concrete bridges, and signalled fully electronically. The panel at Kings Meadow, showing the entire network, is very impressive, and it points to how a small railway needs to be run efficiently. There is no fat to absorb the slack. The railway would not be able to afford the legacy semaphore signalling or electric staff safe working that some mainland systems clung on to. Another part of the narrative holds that just as journeys need to be long, lines need to be straight and flat as possible. Again, this should be no surprise, and most of the Sydney or Melbourne, Perth or Darwin journeys are over the same straight and flat bits in the heart of the Australian desert. And this includes the world's longest straight section of railway, on the Nullarbor Plain. It does not help rail operators to be stuck with 50km/h limits on winding track, even against winding roads where a truck might still hold 100km/h as much as possible. Here we are in Tasmania. It has been said that if Tasmania were a giant lump of pizza dough, you could roll it flat into a pizza the size of the Australian mainland. There are very few flat and straight bits anywhere on the network. Sure, there are a few glacial valleys with flat bases. Tasmania had glaciers long after they had melted on the mainland. But the very worst of curves we see in Australia, and we particularly see in Queensland, are also here. The narrow gauge made it cheaper to build, but no less friendly to speed. The chances of getting major realignments for the Tasmanian network are zero, unlike in Queensland, but nonetheless the Tassie system survives. So every time you see a winding railway, or the remains of a closed one, we shouldn't jump to thinking that it must be the reason for closure. We think of the former railway in Victoria, on Gunaikuno land, to Yarram and Barry Beach, closed in the 1990s. Sure, this line was in poor condition, winding like the Tasmanian lines, and about as long as a Tasmanian line. Lines can be fixed. The Tassie ones were. The cost could have been borne by the state, as it was in Tassie. Or the Murwillumbah line on Bundjalung country also survived into the 2000s. A manifestly unsuitable line for what we need now. A major urbanising corridor, with its curves and bridges. But thinking back to the 2000s, the local traffics, bananas or sugar, fly ash or timber, and local passengers just needed an operator who cared. A small, humble one like Tasrail, or the line beyond Bunbury. We covered it in our recent episode Back on Track, down to Pemberton and Northcliffe. It should have had a mix of timber, tourist and minerals. Now it has nothing. It is rotting in the ground. Or the line to Kingaroy in Waka Waka country, or Mount Gambier on the land of the Bowendick people. All good examples. All could have been worked by a small, humble operator with government help to fix the track and bridges. But instead, we've lost these corridors. Got far too many trucks. And and the expense to government has not gone away. So many opportunities to have taken a leaf out of Tassie's book. In a future episode, we will make the more general case for the US short line. For now, you can see this micro network has offered so much to our capacity to manage railways, and refutes the silly narratives. You'll also notice that Tasmanian trains are not particularly long. In our last episode, Our Finest Hour, we discussed the Queensland coal trains, that are made at impossible lengths using locomotives in the middle of the train as well as at the front. This system was called Locotrol, and allowed trains that go for kilometres. But you need to have that much freight. And typically in Tasmania there isn't that much. The coal trains from Fingal are fairly short, as are the cement trains. Other trains get to a good length, but not spectacular. So how crucial it must be to run these trains as efficiently as possible. And on to passengers. Refuting the false narrative that Tasmania has no passenger trains is easy. We see them regularly here, on the far west coast of Queenstown, at Don in Devonport suburbs, in Hobart suburbs at Glenorchy, and in the mountains at Tulla. We occasionally see them at Sheffield. These rail carts in the upper Derwent at Medina. We certainly hope to see more back in the near future. At Lilydale in the northeast, and in the far south in the Huon Valley at Ida Bay, and maybe other places too. This isn't pedantry. These are as much passenger trains as anything else you might imagine. None are operated by Tasrail, or are on the active Tasrail network. They are intended for the general public. Local efforts to save Hobart trains and the Tasman Limited in the 1970s came to nothing. There is nothing fundamentally wrong with passenger trains if the market is there. And apparently it is. These trains could be labelled tourist trains. But it begs the question, why aren't all trains tourist trains? And this doesn't just apply to Tasmania, but all the trains we've lamented. Ones to Yarram or Murwillumbah, or Pemberton or Mount Gambier. Not all destinations are blessed with being tourist drawcards, but many are. And when they are, rail should have survived. A tourist train typically offers better service. Things like comfortable carriages, on-board service, convenient departure times, but usually for a higher price. But the option of charging higher prices was always there. That's the beauty of rail. You can have different carriages for different price levels. All these trains to Healesville in Wurundjeri country. We saw that in episode 3, the accidental death of a railway. The volunteer run lines to Dalesford or Malden. The revived Mudgee line in Wiradjuri country. Or the Cowra line, the line in the Barossa Valley on Paramank land. Should be no different to the lines we see in daily operation, like the famous Kuranda line on lands belonging to the Jubagay people. Should have been made available by the main rail operator at a raised price for a better service. A higher price helping to recover the cost, but offered whether or not it made a strict accounting profit. Instead, these lines were allowed to close. So a bit like the difference between a train and a tram, in other words, no difference, there should be no difference between a tourist train and any other. Only that tourists may pay a higher fare for a better service, and that deals Tasmania back into the game. Case for Hobart is even stronger than just tourism. Even though much of the corridor from Bridgewater on the Derwent into Hobart City is now freeway, the traffic is very bad for a city of a mere 200,000 people. And the 1970s closure decision, whatever its merits at the time, is clearly in error. Locals are making the case for rail to return, either as heavy rail, maybe a rail car, or light rail. The latter would suggest you make it narrow gauge, and entirely within the old corridor, or standard gauge, and not necessarily on the old line. Relating to our episode 12, Back on Track, the Under the Clocks blog did some rough estimation on the population strip along the north of the island, encompassing Launceston through to Wynyard, along the Tamar estuary, then along the coast. And we also get a population similar to Hobart, though more spread out. This has the historic handicap of being very poor route alignment, then along the coast to Burnie and Wynyard using parts of the road corridor, as well as the Tasrail network, and make it fast and electric, like the Mandurah standard we looked at in episode 7. Maybe something like Belgium's famous Coast Light Rail, the longest in the world. A street-running train where it needs to be, corridor-based where it can. All up, Tasmania has a lot of potential. A chance, with its short distances and relatively small population, to offer its residents a service as good as anywhere on the mainland, from Hobart north to Brighton, and from Lonnie to Wynyard. This, and the freight, should not be costing the voter too much, if at least it is done efficiently, and without the massive overheads we see in transport operators as we reboard the plane. This is a message to encourage rail fans who have not seen this system to come see for themselves. And the flights down here are cheap. Unfortunately, most freights run at night, but you can see from the footage in this episode there are some around in daytime. Tasrail don't publish their timetable, but an old one put together by an enthusiast can be found in the links below this page. And fans should spend $1 or $3 if they can at the different tourist railways in the state. This state has the potential to become a tourist rail hotspot, something like North Wales or the Isle of Man. If only the state government got behind it. But you can help too. Next time, in Radically Rethinking Railways in Australia, we turn to the problem of transport advocacy and urban planning. How well-meaning people actually make it hard for railways in Australia. A lot of the theory is right, but how they put it is not. In our next episode, with friends like these. See you then.